For this week, we have the readings from Exodus chapter 6, verse 28 to chapter 9, verse 12, where Moses confronts Pharaoh, and then God continues a reign of plagues. We read about the first 6 plagues, and we'll read about the final 4 next week. But we start off in the passage with Moses once again doubting his capabilities, which actually is a good thing in and of itself. Some of us have heard the saying, God never gives us more than we can handle, which is one of the many false feel-good statements Christians have come up with in the past centuries. I mean, along with Jesus, take the wheel, and if you don't feel peace, it's not from God. But this idea that God never gives us more than we can handle is preposterous, because if that was the case, we'd never need God in the first place, and more so, we'd never realize our own weakness and helplessness as humans. Because when God gives us more than we can handle, we have 2 options. 1, we can run away and try to comfort ourselves in our failure with the idea that God has asked too much of us. Or we can trust that God will provide me the grace necessary to succeed in where my human strength becomes insufficient. But Moses isn't being humble when he says in verse 30, "Since I am a poor speaker, why would Pharaoh listen to me?" He's expressing a distrust in God's promise. We can see a beautiful dichotomy of this in the Nativity story, whereas our Immaculate Mother, Mary, asks the Archangel Gabriel in Luke chapter 1, verse 34, "How can this be, since I am a virgin?" Now, this is a question of clarification of how this pregnancy will work and how she will participate in this miracle. But Zechariah's question in the same chapter, a few verses before, in verse 18, he asks the same archangel, "How will I know this is so? For I am an old man and my wife is getting on in years." Now, this is a question of disbelief, and we know this to be true because he receives a punishment from the angel. So then God responds to Moses' disbelief in chapter 7 of Exodus, where he says, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh." St. Ambrose comments on this passage by saying, Moses' virtues far exceed Pharaoh's. Moses is not given into sinful behavior and his passions do not rule him. So God has castigated his flesh with an authority that is almost regal. Now, is Moses the most virtuous man in Scripture? Absolutely not. We've seen him exhibit some virtues so far, but not many. But Moses is not placed as God to Pharaoh by Moses' works or doings, but it is because God castigated Moses with divine authority. And Moses is God's anointed one. And because of this, despite his many flaws and weaknesses, Moses has been placed at a level of authority above Pharaoh, which no man would have given him. No number of rhetoric classes would have provided, but only God himself could bestow this upon Moses. So now Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh, and they perform these miraculous signs. So Pharaoh summons the wise men and the sorcerers, and they also perform the same signs using their secret arts. And Pharaoh, in this, tries to deflate God's power through alternatives, achieving what is seemingly the same result through a means that isn't God. Now, how many times have we seen this in our society today? You feel terrible? Well, try this diet, read this book, here's a website, listen to this podcast. And these aren't all bad things, but when our hope for renewal is rooted in these man-made items instead of the God of the universe who created man himself, then that's where we deflate God's power and entrust things to the world. Now we get to the first plague and we see that Moses strikes the water that is in the Nile and it turns to blood. But what does this symbolize? On the grand scheme of all these plagues, each plague represents the overpowering of one of the Egyptian deities. God is showcasing his power not just to the Egyptians, but to his nation of Israel. So God turning the Nile to blood contends with Hapi, the god of the Nile. Plague of frogs contends with Hecate, goddess of fertility, of water and renewal. The gnats contend with Geb, god of the earth. The flies contend with Khepri, god of creation. The livestock dying contends with Hathor, goddess of love and protection. The boils contends with Iris, goddess of medicine and peace. And we'll talk about the final 4 plagues later and what those deities link to. But you can see that in each scenario, God is placing his omnipotence, his ultimate power on display for all to see. Now, the Nile turning to blood has another meaning, and this is going to preface what we'll talk about in later weeks. But what is blood? It's the symbol of physical existence, the material of human nature. What is water? the source of human life. But now this source of life has become a source of death and decay. I mean, the Nile literally smells of rotten, dead fish. In a later week, in a later Bible study, we'll talk through on how God transforms blood from being a symbol of just death and decay into a symbol of life that is actually going to be stronger than water itself. Now, just to touch on a couple more things. First, chapter 8, verse 28. Pharaoh tries to come to a compromise with Moses and says, I will let you go to sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness, provided you do not go very far away. Sometimes Satan allows us to have breaks from slavery. Maybe that looks like Lent to you, or a retreat, or a novena, or a Bible camp. And we always seem to come back with a spiritual high from those. But Satan doesn't want us to go far because he wants to keep us enslaved. So we have to make sure that in our lives, we aren't staying a close and comfortable distance from these pharaohs in our life and also with God, but that we go completely as far away as possible and stay away so that we are the closest to God that we can be. Now it says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He rescinds the offer later, but some of us can get a little wary when scripture says things like God hardened Pharaoh's heart, because then we ask about free will and we ask, well, did Pharaoh really have a choice? And if he didn't have a choice, how can God judge him this harshly? There's an analogy that I like to think of in this situation. Imagine that you have a stick of butter and a block of soft clay, and you place both of them outside on a hot summer's day, directly in the sun. What's going to happen? Well, the butter is going to melt in the presence of the sun, but the clay is going to harden in the presence of the same sun. Did the sun harden the clay? Yes, but the sun also melted the butter, showing that the sun isn't the factor that is doing these things, but it's really the disposition of the elements being placed in proximity to the sun that affects the result. You see, whenever we come to church or into prayer, or whenever we encounter a moment with God in our lives, we can control the disposition of our hearts. We can either present our hearts as butter or as clay. God doesn't change. If we come to him with our hearts of butter, they will melt and we will be softened, and we will listen to him, we will obey him, we will apply what he wants to our lives. If we come to him with hearts of clay, God isn't going to stop being the sun suddenly. He's not going to be something else to prevent our hearts from hardening. No, he hardens our hearts, but only because our disposition has created this in the first place. Finally, Pharaoh says something odd in chapter 8, verse 10 that I'd like to highlight finally. Where Moses says that he will gladly pray to God to remove these plagues from Pharaoh's house, Pharaoh's response is tomorrow. Moses asks him, when would you like me to do this? Just say the word. Pharaoh says tomorrow. Moses says, as you say. Now, you'd think if something was plaguing your house, you'd want it gone today, not tomorrow. But Pharaoh once again shines a light onto our own hearts. Perhaps you've been in a spot where the Lord has revealed to you an unhealthy habit, or perhaps it's a habitual sin. It could be maybe a struggle with masturbation, or maybe it's a struggle of going to bed on time, or maybe being short with your spouse, or maybe it's gossiping with your coworkers. And you know a simple step you could take to fix those. You could maybe for masturbation, maybe it's just putting restrictions on your phone, or maybe getting rid of your phone. Perhaps for going to bed on time, you just have to turn the TV off at 9 p.m. rather than 11. And maybe for something like gossiping with your coworkers, maybe just don't talk to those people who bring out the worst in you. Or when you're being short with your wife, maybe you just need to pray more to allow God's patience to come into your life. Like, whatever it is, there's always something that God is providing us as a source of being able to sanctify ourselves, to become better, to become more like Christ. And yet, how many times do we know the exact thing we should do to help ourselves get out of these bad habits, these bad habitual states of sin? And we just look at God and we just say, tomorrow. I've had a long day. Work was tough. Kids were exhausting. I'm tired. I just want to watch Netflix. I'll work on myself tomorrow. If something is plaguing your house, and our bodies are a temple of God, if something is plaguing you, we shouldn't ask God to take it away tomorrow. We should ask God to take it away today. So now what? I pray that everyone in this Bible study and anyone that is watching this video, that we reflect on what are the things in our life that are plaguing our health, our spiritual health, and for us to look at God and to tell Him today, not tomorrow.